My friends, the country that we're going to be discussing here today may easily have one of the most unique economies and structures on Earth. I want you to imagine a place where prices rarely go up for goods and services. A place where prosperity was so insane 40 years ago that the government is still, to this day, spending the money that it had saved and invested back then. A country which, depending upon the economist that you actually go and listen to, is either on the verge of an economic collapse or is fine, that literally nothing is wrong in any given year. And yet, despite these contradictions between prosperity and collapse and everything in between that it seems to be experiencing, still, this is one of the world's 4 largest economies. Simon Kuznets, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1971, honestly put it best when he said, quote, "There are 4 types of countries in the world: developed, undeveloped, Argentina, and Japan." Yes, that is right, my friends. We have made more than one video in the past when describing Argentina and all of its economic problems, which, actually, on that note, I am going to need to go back and make a follow-up video on it. So now, what we're going to be doing is talking about the opposite end of that spectrum. We're talking about the land of the rising sun, Japan. And if you stick around, well, you're also going to get the answer to one of anime's greatest questions as well. So keep watching. For those of you who have not seen what has happened, the Japanese yen has absolutely crashed. And in order to tell the story of how Japan's economy ended up the way that it did, well, we're going to have to go all the way back to the Edo period. Okay, no, I'm kidding. We're not going that far back, guys. That would be pretty wild. No, my friends, instead we are going to have to go back to the post-World War II period, which, for talking about this for Japan, would be obvious, considering that there's no way we could talk about things prior to that, as the entire economy and pretty much everything in Japan was destroyed by that war. Thus, it had to be built back. The situation that Japan found itself in back in 1945 is that the war had been fought, the battles decided, and the bombs had been dropped. Japan itself was a country that was steeped in a rich history of honor that desperately needed to regain its collective honor as a nation. The US military was occupying Japan all the way until 1952, with the specific goal that they had in mind being to completely dismantle the Japanese military. Also, they would need to help the Japanese write a new constitution, and as well to guide its progress in rebuilding its economy. US General Douglas MacArthur was the Allied power supreme commander who was in charge of Japan's post-war transition, and thankfully, for the sake of the Japanese people, he was able to learn from the mistakes of the past. And what I mean by that is the fact that MacArthur knew that to straight up condemn the Japanese people directly would be insane. Everyone had seen what had actually happened with the Germans after World War I and what breeding ground for ideology that brought about. And so it was seen that crippling their economy with massive fees and reparations would only cause the Japanese to easily be roused to war in another 20 years or so. It was nothing that anyone wanted to see again. So MacArthur spoke to their frustration at how the military commanders at the time had stoked them into nationalistic fervor. And most importantly, the US government would give Japanese Emperor Hirohito a way to retain his honor instead of trying him for war crimes and removing him from the throne. They would instead allow him to remain on the throne as a kind of figurehead, much like what you see with the current royal family of the United Kingdom. And so this, my friends, would mean that Japan would now transition from being an ultranationalist imperialist state to a democratic constitutional monarchy, with an emphasis on the democratic part. This wasn't going to be easy though, and even the emperor knew this. Sidney Mashbeer, who was a colonel in the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, or ATIS, of US military intelligence, encouraged MacArthur to avoid embarrassing the emperor by forcing him to read a prepared script. And so instead, delivered on August 15th, 1945, this pre-recorded message would be the first time that the emperor's voice had ever been heard by the everyday Japanese citizens. After decades of feeding Japanese people the virtues of imperialism and expansionism, the emperor instead stressed in his speech the need for humility and stoicism. Quote, "The hardships and sufferings to which our nation is to be subjected hereafter will certainly be great. Japanese citizens," he stated, "must endure the unendurable, to bear the unbearable."
今後テクノを置くべき苦難はもとより尋常にあらず平のために太平洋を開かんと欲す人はここに
The formal surrender would take place on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, administered by General MacArthur. High-pitched and formal, the emperor never once uttered the word surrender, instead implying that Japan was choosing peace in lieu of constantly escalating atomic warfare that would destroy not only all of Japan, but the entire world, leading to human extinction. And so, in a schoolyard argument sense, the speech was pretty much the Japanese leadership kind of way of saying, oh, we'd kill everybody, but then there'd be no one left to kill, so we're taking our bombs and we're going home. Regardless of the logical sense that this did or did not make, depending upon your perspective, the Japanese concept of national honor was restored, and the country was then free to move forward and recreate itself. And oh boy, did they ever do this. It's important that we go into the politics of this entire situation so that you understand how we get to the economy that we did and the problems that the state now faces. Containing some 103 articles, the Japanese Constitution went into effect on May 3rd, 1947. Its sweeping provisions would encompass land reform, women's suffrage, the establishment of free speech, assembly and religion, the institution of labor unions, and the establishment of US-style educational reforms. This was the beginning of not only the US and Japan's close economic ties, as well as alliances and partnerships, but it would shortly thereafter go from a US-backed initiative to a wholly Japanese-owned juggernaut. Like, look, when we were describing this, if economies were spaceship launches, the next period would be the primary thrust stage. We're talking about where the vehicle slowly rumbles and pushes off of the ground, gaining speed, momentum, and temperature. This, my friends, is the Japanese economic miracle. Hey everyone, Sakuya here, and before we get back to the episode, I just want to thank each and every person that went on my trip to Italy here with me and my wife, because I had a ton of fun with you all. Whether it was going to the Roman Colosseum, whether it was exploring the forums, whether it was going to all these different things, it was an absolute blast, and I cannot wait to see more of you in future trips. One of the things that I love, perhaps more than anything else about this job, is specifically that I get to go to places and meet with people all over the world. That's something that I've always enjoyed. And for anyone who's watching this right now, it would make my world if you would join me at the German Christmas markets that I will be leading a trip to here come this November. We are going to see the Christmas markets in Munich, in Salzburg, and Vienna. We are also going to see castles. We're going to see all kinds of different sites, and even beyond that, just the base trip, we're also going to be going and doing a little bit of exploring around and seeing other things with some people while we're there. Honestly, when you go on one of these trips, it's really nice because you don't typically have to worry about planning anything. From having a guide who speaks the local language to be able to take you around, from your hotel accommodations being taken care of while you're there, and in general, the fun of going to places in a group, it's not something that I can really describe. It's just something that you have to experience for yourself. There's only a limited amount of spots, so if you want to join me on this trip to Germany, you only have to put 25% down if you book it now. And beyond that, there are payment plans moving forward in order to make things easier for people. Obviously, at different points, I'm going to do more random meetups with people, but if you want to go on a dedicated trip with me, this is your chance. Thank you, everyone. Now back to the show. You see, under the Allied occupation forces, land and labor reforms were carried out, and the plan for creating a self-sustaining economy was mapped out by American banker Joseph Dodge. The respect by Americans in general towards the Japanese went a long way towards healing the wounds of the past and forging new economic and business relationships. The Japanese people would rally together in a way that pretty much only they could do and got to work. During this time, they started making things at a record pace, and oddly enough, it was actually going to be another war that would be their first opportunity for the Japanese to show the world exactly what they were capable of. And we will get into that, but also this is where we need to recognize the assistance of a key person in the Japanese post-war regrowth. In the year 1947, W. Edwards Deming was asked by the US Department of the Army to assist with the upcoming Japanese census, as well as rebuilding the economy itself. He was brought over at the behest of General Douglas MacArthur, who had grown frustrated at being unable to complete so much as a phone call without the line going dead due to the fact that, well, basically the entire country of Japan had been destroyed. So while in Japan, Deming's expertise in quality control techniques combined with his involvement in Japanese society would bring him an invitation from the Union of Japanese Scientists and Engineers, or JUSE, or as I'm going to call it here, JUSE. JUSE members had studied the latest business techniques from Western companies, and as part of Japan's reconstruction efforts, they sought an expert to teach them the finer points of statistical analysis and quality control. From June to August 1950, Deming would train hundreds of engineers, managers, scholars, all different kinds of people in the concepts of quality. He also conducted at least one session for top management, which included the top Japanese industrialists of the likes of Akio Morita, who was the co-founder of Sony, mind you. The message that Deming would give to Japan's top chief executives was that improving quality was going to reduce expenses while increasing productivity and market share. It seems pretty obvious when we look at nowadays, but back in a day of almost semi-feudalistic structures, this was a very big deal. Perhaps the best known of these management lectures was delivered at the Mount Hakone Conference Center in August of 1950. What would happen is that a number of Japanese manufacturers would apply his techniques widely, and they would experience heretofore unheard of levels of quality and productivity. The improved quality combined with the lowered cost went and created new international demand for Japanese products. Within the business world, Deming was pretty much a celebrity now, and yet he declined to receive royalties from the transcripts of his 1950 lectures. So instead, what Juicy's board of directors did is they established the Deming Prize, this being something to repay him for his friendship and kindness. Within Japan, to this day, the Deming Prize continues to exert considerable influence on the disciples of quality control and quality management, and this would become a core technique and idea of the Japanese. So now quality is covered, okay, but what about the war? Well, I'm sure as many people are aware, the Korean War would shortly follow World War II, and the outbreak of this war in 1950 would create a huge demand for Japanese goods and would set off an investment drive that laid the foundations for a long period of extraordinary economic activity. It really does follow a simple train of logic. The US realized that instead of producing so many goods and needed supplies for its army at home, it could simply just pay Japan to make these products for a fraction of the cost and then ship them a few hours away instead of producing them and then shipping them from an entire ocean away. It was really just that simple. While investments in plants and equipment were spurred by an expanding domestic market, Japan then also began to pursue strong export policies. Growing demand overseas for Japanese goods would then lead to an annual trade surplus, which, with a brief interlude in 1979 to 1980, would become perennial by the late 1960s. It was constant. So at this point, the Japanese economy is booming, but the question is going to come, how exactly was this accomplished? First, we're going to have to talk about the MITI, the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry. In his book, MITI and the Japanese Miracle, The Growth of Industrial Policy, 1925 to 1975, Chalmers Johnson would speculate that this post-war period is where the Japanese economy truly becomes unique. Johnson continued to posit that the United States and a large part of the world are conforming to a regulatory system, which means that the free market is the most essential actor in these countries' economic environments. The government or central authorities merely play a regulatory role to keep a fair, open, and competitive market running. Private firms are left alone under these circumstances, and governmental interference would only occur when the freedom of the market is threatened or weakened. But in contrast to this, in Japan, Johnson argued that there existed a developmental government. Instead of being an objective observer to the free market, the Japanese government actively participated in the development of private firms through measures carried out by MITI. The MITI was the key actor to devise and direct the direction of national economic expansion and to lay out the grand blueprint of Japan's developmental trajectory. And honestly, he's right. The MITI were massively influential in the post-war period and before the 1970s. This influence weakened when Japan later switched from a fixed currency to a floating currency, which is a currency whose values actually fluctuate according to market changes. For anyone who saw my previous video when talking about things with Egypt, yeah, you'll see what some of the issues with that are. The biggest legacy of the MITI, though, has probably got to be the development and introduction of the Keiretsu system. Keiretsu are conglomerates which are composed of companies with interlocking relationships and shareholdings. In other words, if you wanted to compare this to anything, if the Japanese economy were an episode of Survivor, the Keiretsu would be an early alliance that lasted all the way through the last episodes of the season. We're talking real ride or die type energy for the business world, to say the least. When we were talking about these things, you have two kinds of Keiretsu: horizontally integrated and vertically integrated. Horizontally integrated means that there are companies across industries who are interlinked together through purchasing shares of each other on the stock market together. The leading horizontal Japanese Keiretsu, also referred to as the Big Six, include Fuyo, Sanwa, Sumitomo, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, and the DKB group. Membership in horizontal Keiretsu is often loose, and often not something considered in day-to-day decision-making by its members. Vertically integrated, however, means that multiple companies supply each other or work together for the benefit of the largest company amongst them. Toyota is considered to be the largest vertically integrated Keiretsu group, for example. Other large vertical Keiretsu include Toshiba and Nissan. What essentially happens is that one or more sub-companies arranged in tiers of importance are created to benefit the parent company. Major suppliers will form the second tier beneath the parent, and smaller manufacturing companies make up the third and fourth tiers. Those at the highest levels are the most profitable and most insulated from fluctuations in the market. These are in turn pretty strong, and vertical Keiretsu is considered to be a very effective and competitive organizational model in the car industry due to these factors. The major Keiretsu were each centered on one bank, which lent money to the Keiretsu member companies and held equity positions in the company. Each bank had great control over companies in the Keiretsu and would act as a monitoring and emergency bailout entity. One effect of this structure was to minimize the presence of hostile takeovers in Japan, because really no entities could challenge the power of the banks. So it was then that the MITI helped to make these recovering and developing companies strong during the post-war recovery. It also guided the economy into major directions that the MITI wanted to invest the nation's efforts towards, and in the early days this would have been things like coal mining, steel production, shipbuilding, and chemical manufacturing. These were great to get the economy up and running again, and they would also heavily push for investment in a new and burgeoning field: electronics. In the year 1952, Masaru Ibuka would travel to the United States after hearing that AT&T was going to be selling licenses to other companies. Ibuka's company, Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Corporation, was a small electronics manufacturer needing a new product to help it succeed. Ibuka recognized the potential in this particular opportunity and quickly contacted MITI requesting approval for a loan of $55,000 in order to purchase the license. This is something that would illustrate a key difference in the Japanese economy at the time. Essentially, heads of companies would be able to lobby directly to the banks themselves for quick capital that would be needed to ensure growth and innovation in the market. You didn't need to wait through long periods of bureaucracy in order to make something like that happen. Ibuka's company is the perfect example of this, and after realizing that transistor radios would be the best choice for their next product, Ibuka and his co-founder Akio Morita would change the name of their company to Sony. Yes, my friends, that's Sony. That is the origin of the company. The first product that Sony would release would be the TR-55 transistor radio. This model did very well, but Sony then upped its game and released the TR-63, a portable radio that could fit in one shirt pocket. And this thing, my friends, sold like tickets to a Taylor Swift concert. It was insane. It was the first transistor radio to sell more than 1 million units, and it set Japan on the new path creating consumer electronics. Sony would then very quickly grow from 7 employees to over 500 in the span of just a couple years. It was around this time that the United States would lobby for significantly more foreign loans to Japan, as well as more foreign investment with the rest of the global banking community. By the year 1956, Japan's real per capita GDP had overtaken the pre-war 1940 level. During the recovery period, 1945 to 1956, per capita GDP would rise at an average rate of 7.1%. And this, my friends, would lead into the year 1960, when Hayato Ikeda was elected Prime Minister of Japan. Ikeda was determined to bring the Japanese economy into power as a dominant economic power in the world, and his commitment showed when he introduced a series of tax breaks, infrastructure investments, and export incentives to turbocharge the economy's growth. His plan? To double the size of Japan's economy over the span of 10 years. The crazy part is, Japan actually achieved this feat in less than 7 years though. At the same time, it would change the way that a generation of Japanese workers and business owners would look at their country and its potential. As Nick Kapoor would state in his book, Japan at the Crossroads, it enshrined economic growthism as a national secular religion of both the Japanese people and their government, bringing about a circumstance in which both the effectiveness of the government and the worth of the populace came to be measured above all else by the annual percentage change in GDP. This is a very big difference in national thought, mind you. Sure, many Japanese people adhered to the practices of Shinto, but this growth was embraced by the entire country. And if there is one thing that the Japanese can do better than almost any other kind of people out there, it is uniting their efforts in the pursuit of a common cause. What's interesting to note is that the Japanese economic miracle also inspired and set the blueprints for the economic ascendance of other countries like China, Taiwan, and South Korea. In less than 20 years, the Japanese economy had not only bounced back from near complete destruction, but it was now thriving. The average Japanese family now possessed its three treasures, this being a refrigerator, a washing machine, and a television. Prosperity that was near on unheard of prior. Additionally, the Japanese financial sector received significant guidance from American economists and business consultants like the previously mentioned W. Edwards Deming throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. In 1968, Japan actually became the second largest economy in the world due to these strong business practices and the nation's unwavering focus on quality and innovation. And finally, the other main aspect that guided the Japanese economic miracle would be the window guidance. This was essentially the Bank of Japan guiding other smaller banks and investment companies where to invest their money by instituting a mandatory percentage of lending that had to be invested in certain industries or financial sectors. The goal here was to regulate the supply of credit as a method to achieve policy targets for growth and sustainability. In other words, you couldn't just invest in what was profitable right now, they had to invest in certain sectors that they needed for the economy to improve later on, which was really innovative. Under the Bank of Japan law of 1958, the Ministry of Finance would take control over the Bank of Japan's administration, embedding the Japanese government's fiscal goals into the Bank of Japan's policies and allowing for greater flexibility in the regulation of the money supply. So it was then that during Hayato Ikeda's income doubling plan during the 1960s, the Bank of Japan was given full control of monetary instruments in the economy and was fully responsible for the swings in the business cycle during the 60s to 70s period. This, combined with strict capital controls suppressing the private sector's ability to issue corporate bonds, gave the Bank of Japan a substantial amount of influence in the bond market. Now mind you, for anyone who understands economics, this level of economic control by the state may be a little bit distressing for those of us in other countries that aren't Japan. But mind you, they really needed some stability after the war. Also, it's always going to be generally easier for a more collectivist societies who submit to this level of government economic control than for a more individualistic society such as the United States. Window guidance was a policy that served Japan well during the regrowth period, and by the 1980s, it really was no longer needed, and therefore, at that time, was done away with. So, domestically, Ikeda would fulfill his promise to expand the social safety net in support of the income doubling plan. A universal national pension scheme was established in 1961, together with a system of universal health insurance. Another thing was the Physically Disabled Persons Employment Promotion Law, which, that is in and of itself a mouthful. That was passed in 1960 to promote the employment of people with physical disabilities through the creation of an employment quota system in Japan, an on-the-job adjustment scheme, and a financial assistance system, in addition to offering vocational guidance and placement services through approximately 600 public employment security offices and their branch offices. In other words, all the people that possibly may have been severely injured by the war or disabled were actually going to be able to work and do more. In addition, the 1963 welfare law for the aged would provide funding for respite care, homes for the aged, and other services paid by taxes collected through local and central governments. Japanese economist Takafusa Nakamura would conclude that, quote, Ikeda was the single most important figure in Japan's rapid economic growth. He will be remembered as the man who pulled together a national consensus for economic growth and who strove unceasingly for the realization of that goal. The craziness would only continue when Ikeda would contract laryngeal cancer in September of 1964, but even that cancer could not keep him from witnessing the massive event that was planned to celebrate Japan's return to prominence: hosting the Olympic Games. By the time the 1964 Tokyo Olympic Games began, Japan had bounced back. It was a roaring success, and it was ready to become the world's largest exporter. The world could now see that Japan had recreated itself, and Hayato Ikeda beamed proudly as he watched the games occur. His plan had worked. His people had a future that looked bright. Now he could rest. And so it was then that on October 25th, the day after the Tokyo Olympics would end, Ikeda would retire his position and sought medical care. And less than 6 months later, he would pass in August of 1965. Anyway, back to MITI. With Japan now being on the forefront of innovation and growth, now MITI could turn its focus to semiconductors. Japanese industrial policy would help semiconductor companies gain global market share. Notably, funding for research and development in semiconductor manufacturing equipment would grow to 26% of Japan's total R&D spending in 1977, up from just 2% at the beginning of the 1970s. In addition, the Japanese government invested $300 million towards the establishment of a public-private joint technology research project called the Super LSI Technology Research Association with Japan's 6 main computer companies. This being Fujitsu, Hitachi, NEC, Mitsubishi Electric, NTT, and Toshiba in 1976. Together, these companies managed a joint laboratory in Japan's Kanagawa Prefecture that focused solely on researching fundamental technology for semiconductors and avoiding technology leakage to competitors. This is the really weird part about the Japanese economy that just worked in this time and is not something that you would see in many other places. This joint research project, featuring collaboration amongst rival companies, contributed to the development of a common technology platform for companies to work collaboratively and share information to drive innovation. Beyond the 6 companies originally involved in the research consortium, other Japanese companies involved in producing equipment and raw materials for semiconductor manufacturing also joined Super LSI Technology Research Association projects. This would result in the development of a wide variety of new innovations related to semiconductor design and manufacturing, with over 1,000 new patents related to semiconductor design and production being registered due to the collaborative nature of the project. After 4 years of collaborative work, the association would develop the technique of electron beam lithography, or EBL, a revolution in chip-making equipment technology, which paved the way for the manufacturing of even more complex semiconductors at scale. EBL was eventually commercialized by ASML, Nikon Corporation, and Canon Inc. This technological leap would help facilitate Japanese dominance in the global semiconductor market, with Japanese firms accounting for 51% of worldwide sales by 1988. This success would spill over into multiple parts of the tech industry. At one point in time, Japanese production accounted for over 90% of all 256K DRAM memory sold. But okay, we've been talking all this time about economic boom, but let's take a quick glance at what this means for the average Japanese worker's quality of life during this time. GDP is honestly a less useful tool for measuring this, so we're going to need to look instead at the country's PPP. Purchasing Power Parity, or PPP, is a hypothetical exchange rate adjusted for the differences in prices. Since price levels differ from one country to another, the same amount of money sometimes just buys a lot of more things in one country, and other times only a little. In Japan, prices are high, so $1, or its yen equivalent, buys less than in, say, China. This adjustment is necessary to compare income and living standards across countries correctly. In terms of per capita income at purchasing power parity,
Pummeling petty powder puffs in my prime.
Japan surpassed Italy in 1966 and the UK around 1975. However, Japan did not overtake the US, West Germany, or France, but came close to their income levels by the mid-1970s. Thus, we can say that Japan was firmly in the highest income group by the 1970s. Another way to measure income is by affordability of consumer durables. Looking at this from the beginning, it took 10.7 months of an average salary to buy a new car, at least the most basic model, in 1966. But Japanese workers had to work only 4 months to buy a car in 1974, and by 1991, a new car could be had after only 2.4 months of working. This is an astonishing level of growth. By the 1970s, virtually all Japanese households were equipped with washing machines, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, telephones, color TVs. Heading into the 1980s, everything was looking up for Japan. But, as we all know, that wasn't going to last. Where did it go wrong, though? Well, for that, we're going to need to go back in time a little bit and explain another thing about context. You know exactly how we do things here on this channel. First off, the Bretton Woods system. For those who are unfamiliar, the Bretton Woods system from 1944 to 1971, this was a dollar-based and US-centered fixed exchange rate system. It achieved unprecedented global price stability, high growth, and trade liberalization from the 1950s onward. But this system began to show some serious strain in the mid-1960s. As the United States, the center country of the system, began to adopt a more expansionary macroeconomic stance, global inflation emerged in the late 1960s. There was a downward downward pressure on the dollar and corresponding upward pressure on gold and the European and Japanese currencies in the foreign exchange market. So it was then in August of 1971 that the President of the United States at the time, Richard Nixon, would finally announce that the US dollar was no longer fixed to gold and the dollar began to float. But in the case of Japan, what happened is that the Bank of Japan and the central banks in Europe intervened massively to purchase the dollar in order to avoid the appreciation of their own currencies against the dollar. Thus it was from 1971 to 1973 the world tried to reconfigure the major currencies at new exchange parities, but the effort largely failed. Under severe speculative attacks, the world would enter into an era of floating major currencies in early 1973. Since then, the general currency floating has continued to this very day, and soon it was discovered that pure float was simply way too volatile and dangerous to national economies. Japan's main external problem in the 1950s to the mid-1960s was how to cope with an emerging trade deficit. But after the mid-1960s, the problem shifted to the opposite: how to reduce its huge trade surplus. One may wonder, why is that a bad thing? Doesn't that seem like a good thing that everyone wants to buy your goods? Well, the trade surplus was politically undesirable for Japan because it really did anger people within the United States, in particular Congress and the industrial sector lobbies. Especially after the 1980s, Japan would record the largest trade surplus, and the US had the largest trade deficit in the world, year after year. Furthermore, the size of Japan's surplus and that of the American deficit were similar. Japanese saving was used to finance American overspending, and that became the largest financial flow in the world economy. So, okay. Alright, let's quickly recap where we are at here so far, because a lot is about to happen and you will need to understand where we are. In less than 40 years, Japan has gone from a post-war rubble to becoming the second largest economy in the world, on track to overtake the United States sometime in the 1990s. They have done so by making innovation, productivity, and quality a hallmark of their exports, and they are making money like it's going out of style and investing it just as quickly. The average person in 1980s Japan could afford to go out drinking and partying nightly if they chose to, and investing in land, or just sinking lots of money into stocks. This was a common thing to do. It was like the Japanese could not lose. Everyone who was on the global scene wanted to invest in Japan. To give you an idea of just how hot the economy was, this is what you need to understand. In every single first world country, kids were walking around listening to Sony Walkmans. The dads were using Japanese camcorders. The more fuel-efficient Japanese automobiles were growing in popularity after the oil shocks of the 1970s. Japan was benefiting from all of this, but not everyone was happy about the situation. In 1981, United States President Ronald Reagan would put extreme pressure on the Japanese government until they agreed to voluntary export restraints on Japanese autos that were the equivalent of a tariff rate exceeding 60%. In 1983, Reagan would place a 100% tariff, which is a huge amount, mind you, on Japanese motorcycles in an effort to save Harley-Davidson from going out of business, which actually did work. America was able to exert such pressure on Japan at the time because it was both Japan's major overseas market by a long shot and also its geopolitical defender against the Soviet Union. Japan, after all, didn't really have a military, so it needed the United States for everything. There was also no World Trade Organization, no WTO to constrain unilateral moves at this time. And so, bowing to pressure from the United States, Japanese trade negotiators agreed to a whole constellation of agreements designed to limit exports of steel and cars to the US and expand imports from the US. Coupled with this, they would move to eliminate barriers to the success of American firms in the Japanese market. Effectively, trade negotiators would cook up a whole alphabet soup of deals. By one account, more than 100 different agreements, memorandums of understanding, joint announcements, and communiques in the 1980s and early 1990s. But the greatest damage in the US-Japan trade war of the 1980s, that was yet to come. What we have to mention here at this point is what happened on September 22nd, 1985 at the Plaza Hotel in New York City, the Plaza Accords, the day that would change Japan's economy forever. The Group of Five, or G5, the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the UK, would jointly intervene to lower the overvalued dollar at these talks. The goal was to bring down the value of the dollar compared to the yen and the Deutschmark. Within a year of the Accords, the dollar had dropped in value by over 26%. Little did Japan realize that this would effectively spell the beginning of a long and sad decline for its economy. But it would not feel the effects of this for several years to come. You see, my friends, the Japanese economy is particularly vulnerable to the fluctuation of the yen to dollar rate, since the yen is a lone floater. There is no yen zone in Asia, unlike the eurozone in Europe and the global dollar zone for the United States. Most of Japan's trade and virtually all financial transactions are conducted in dollars. And so Japan, as the largest creditor country, holds a huge amount of unhedged dollar assets, which are concentrated in US government bills and bonds, whose values depreciate when the dollar falls. What this means in plain English is that when the yen becomes overvalued, Japanese output and investments stagnate, prices and wages are suppressed, and financial strain is created. So then how does Japan respond then? Well, they cut taxes and lower interest rates to encourage spending. Since the cost of buying exports from Japan had just gone up dramatically, they wanted people to buy more at home. And for a while, that worked. People continued to spend even more money on real estate and stocks and continued to buy. The Bank of Japan's long-term practices hadn't just engineered currency depreciation, they also hugely inflated asset values. And this is how we get to the unique fact that at one point in time, the value of the land on which the Imperial Palace sits on in Tokyo was worth 4 times more than all the land in the state of California. Yes, you heard me right. At one point in time, all of the land in Japan was estimated to be worth approximately $18 trillion, which was roughly 4 times the value of all of the land in the United States at the time, which doesn't make sense from an economic level when you're thinking about productivity capabilities, but in terms of value and how the Japanese economy functioned, yeah, it was pretty severely overvalued. Here's what you really need to understand. The 8 largest banks in the world at this time were Japanese. Japan's share of the global stock market at this time was nearly 50%, stopping at just 45% in 1989. 13 of the 20 largest companies in the world in 1989 were Japanese. Japan had bought so much American real estate that it owned a third of downtown LA. Mitsubishi Group bought New York's Rockefeller Center. Sony bought Columbia Pictures. And Panasonic purchased Universal Pictures. In 1989, the annual revenue of the pachinko industry alone in Japan was worth more than the entire GDP of the state of Norway. Even today, on a weird note for a little fun fact, yeah, pachinko generates more revenue than Las Vegas, Macau, and Singapore combined. And that's one industry. Golf club memberships soared, and entry to a golf club became so highly sought after that they became a tradable commodity. More money was spent in 1988 on golf club memberships in Japan than the entire GDP of Switzerland. One Yakuza boss even tried to pay nearly $3 million for a membership, but ended up being denied. Not because he was Yakuza, mind you, no, that didn't matter, but because no one wanted to actually give up their membership. He just didn't offer enough cash. This kind of wealth and prosperity was simply not sustainable in the long term. But still, the Japanese would not see it coming. By December of 1989, the Japanese stock market would hit its all-time peak, 5 times higher than where it was at the beginning of the decade. It would never reach that level again, and just 8 months later, it would drop in value by nearly half. My friends, the biggest economic bubble of all time was about to burst, and it was going to be bad. All of the factors that we have been talking about here would just prove to allow the rise of semiconductor dominance by Taiwan and the boom of Korean automobiles in the following decades. The 1990s were coming around, and it was time for the Japanese people to feel the crunch. They were about to enter the lost decade. We've gone over a lot of history here at this point, but the period that we are talking about now specifically leads into where we are today. Like, this is the point that Japan never really recovered from. The 1990s are consistently remembered as a very dark time for the Japanese people. Here is an economy in a country where the #1 goal was to become a lifelong corporate employee, to work insane hours due to loyalty to the company, and in return, the company would provide you with stability and a good pension. Universities could confidently say that if you got a degree, you would be hired by a company fresh out of college. And then, within just a couple of years, that was gone. It had disappeared. College graduates had to settle for less meaningful jobs in their eyes, and the cycle of deflation started. So my friends, I want you to imagine a debt-fueled housing bubble that has just popped. Housing prices are falling, and most people were left with both a massive mortgage and a massively devalued house. You could sell the house, but you would never actually make a profit by the sale. In fact, you would still be losing money in that deal. So it was then that real estate purchases would slow down and the deflation process would start happening across the entire economy. People would respond by buying less stuff, but the supply of stuff had never actually changed. So, since supply is higher than demand, that meant that the price of stuff would drop. The companies then at this point were not making as much profits, so wages would drop for employees. That would in turn lead to more trouble, as the employees would have less money to spend on products, and you can see as to where this cycle is going. All of this would happen in just the span of a few years. And in 1991, the Bank of Japan began dropping interest rates in order to try and spur the economy. Unfortunately, at this point, it was too little, too late. The Bank of Japan responded by bailing out the banks, which in turn infuriated the Japanese public, and the Bank of Japan never bailed out a bank again, as protests were widespread. This would all lead up to 1997, the year in which the rest of Asia had suffered an economic crisis, which Japan was seemingly not all too affected by, since it had such massive savings in foreign reserves, being the #1 foreign purchaser of American bonds and foreign reserves in the world at the time. Then, in the early morning on November 26, 1997, the Japanese Ministry of Finance got a phone call. This phone call was from the Bank of Japan telling them that lines were starting to form in front of the banks. This was not good. A banking crisis is one thing, but a run on the banks by citizens looking to withdraw their funds due to a lack of confidence in the economy, that is something that can set off an economic depression. So while the risk of this was absolutely catastrophic, the Bank of Japan simply couldn't do anything to ease this, as they had already cut interest rates to zero. Japanese officials then told the banks to open their doors and to let in as many people as possible, because people lined up in front of the banks would only attract more attention and create more panic. You would think that in the 90s this wouldn't necessarily matter though, as TV is still very clearly a thing, and obviously people can see what is happening and we'll talk about it, but in what is possibly one of the most Japanese occurrences of all time, without instruction from the government or any collaboration with each other, most Japanese media outlets just unilaterally decided to not report on the matter out of fear that it was going to create more panic and make the situation worse. Again, easily one of the most Japanese things you can possibly describe. It's really hard to imagine the same thing happening in the United States or anywhere in the EU, and it's hard to imagine because it simply would not happen. There is literally no way that a media outlet in the Western world would have passed up a story like that, and it's quite simply amazing and incredible that this happened at all. So it was then that by the afternoon, the lines in front of the banks had dissipated, and a full-on panic was avoided. Debt deflation would come to an end as the 1990s would conclude, and the 2000s would become a continuation of the lost decade. But the first decade of the new century would in turn be marked by inflation expectations more than anything else. In other words, managing the public's expectations that the economy would improve became the most important goal. I've explained this before in previous videos, but hyperinflation is not a good thing. Inflation, however, is not inherently negative. Typically speaking, in most economies, the healthy level of inflation is around 2%. This is something that is good for an economy. Mild inflation helps the government and the private sector pay off their debts and encourages the public to actually go and spend their money so that they're not just holding onto it. While Japan was suffering, China and Korea were taking lessons from its example and beginning their own economic booms that would show results in the 2000s and 2010s. This was great for them, but then during the worst of the lost decade, Japanese companies would make possibly their biggest mistake. They stopped innovating. The thought process goes like this. When you're in a long-term stagnant economy, it's easy to just stay conservative with investing money as a company waiting until the market actually gets better. But when you stop investing in research and development, like the Japanese did, you start to see the effects years later. And so it was then that when it came to technology use in the workplace, the average Japanese worker would fall behind gravely. Here's what you need to understand. The levels of tradition and bureaucracy in the Japanese workplace means that even to this very day, many companies still prioritize the fax machine as the way in which business is done. That is it. And when it comes to general purpose things like improving the use of their software to run every day-to-day thing, they fail absolutely miserably. In fact, some economists think that the US taking the lead in use and development of corporate software was one of the primary reasons that Japan's economic growth was nearly halved in the early 2000s. If anyone has seen my previous video where I talked about the Japanese zombie workers and their work week and how terrible the practice is, yeah, they never left the completely mind-numbing practice of frequently unpaid overtime and up to 100-hour work weeks that salarymen regularly had to suffer through. And so that, in turn, my friends, brings us to the answer of one of the timeless questions of anime. Yes, I know it's a bit of a weird attraction that we're talking about this now. Why is it that so many Japanese animes are set in high school? Well, after what we have described with what it is like working in Japan as an adult, it should come as no surprise that the least stress-filled and most hopeful years of most Japanese men's lives was their high school years. For most, there was no major bills to pay, no company forcing you to work ridiculous hours, and no societal pressures to do anything but be a good student. For most men in Japan, they will never experience such a lack of worry or stress again, so high school has attained this kind of idealized and hallowed state in the Japanese subconscious, thereby being the reason it is the setting for so many of your favorite anime shows. I mean, most of the shows that you probably have created literally would not last being in a Japanese adult setting. And no, we're not talking about the naughty kind of adult. Moving on from this, it is the early 2000s, and the Bank of Japan was facing unemployment over 5%, which doesn't seem bad, but it is quite high for Japan. The bigger issue, though, is no one wants to actually spend any money. Public faith in the economy has never been lower at this point, and they really needed to do something to invigorate the economy. Normally, the protocol in this situation would be to lower interest rates, but they couldn't do that because they were already at negative 0.1%. Yes, for anyone who's confused about that, I really should mention that the interest rates are negative. It actually costs you money to put your money into the bank or an investment. So yes, this is another reason as to why Japan is such a cash-based society, as well as why they avoid keeping their money in the bank more than the citizens of most countries. So okay, if they can't do that, they need to start experimenting. And they do. They then try something that was entirely unheard of at the time, but nowadays is somewhat commonplace amongst world economies: quantitative easing. Quantitative easing, or QE, is a monetary policy action where a central bank purchases predetermined amounts of government bonds or other financial assets in order to stimulate economic activity. It is used to mitigate an economic recession when inflation is very low or negative, making standard monetary policy ineffective. Under quantitative easing, the Bank of Japan would flood commercial banks with excess liquidity in order to promote private lending, leaving them with large stocks of excess reserves and therefore very little risk of ever having a liquidity shortage. If people needed to come in and withdraw their money, they could do so easily. No problem. The Bank of Japan accomplished this by buying more government bonds than would actually be required to set the interest rates to zero. It later would also buy asset-backed securities and equities. What would happen over this time period is that the Bank of Japan would increase commercial bank current amount balances from 5 trillion yen to 35 trillion yen, or approximately 300 billion US dollars, over a 4-year period starting in March of 2001. The Bank of Japan would also triple the quantity of long-term Japanese government bonds that it could purchase on a monthly basis. Like, these guys were doing everything that they possibly could to stimulate the economy. Anything. And so it was then, by 2006, that mild inflation began to return to Japan, and financial leaders began to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Surely, 2007 was going to be a great year for the economy. And then you all obviously remember from any of my other videos what happens next. Global financial crisis and recession. Yes, my friends, the global recession hits, and while it did start in the United States before spreading across the world, it hit Japan extra hard because Japan, as people remember from what we've been talking about with this episode, it has always been a very export-based economy. Export-based economies are always going to be more susceptible to changes in global markets than other countries, but the 2007 global recession would cause a greater total percentage loss in revenue to Japan than even the United States, where it actually originated from. That is how bad this was. Japan would thus suffer for a couple of years, and then Shinzo Abe would come into power on the promise of getting the economy back on track. Abe would introduce the fiscal experiments known as Abenomics to the Japanese economy, and these included several radical financial experiments. The government kept interest rates negative and began ramping up the quantitative easing, buying more short-term government debt, long-term government debt, and corporate debt. By the time that it was done, the Bank of Japan had purchased more than 70% of the government's debt. In comparison, mind you, the UK owns barely 30% of its own debt. That is how high of a number we are talking here. So this then, my friends, is a very high degree of debt, and the Bank of Japan then begins to straight up buy shares on the stock market, to the point now that it's rumored that the Bank of Japan currently holds nearly 7% of the entire Japanese stock market. Unfortunately, none of this really helped to raise inflation much. The Japanese economy stayed stagnant. Abe even had to give corporations several tax cuts and deregulations so that they could invest in innovation and start paying off their debts. Well, try as he might, Abe could not overcome the traditional Japanese concept of conservative spending that caused these companies not to invest in innovation, but instead they would simply save the money or pass it on to their very patient shareholders, who then in turn saved it. No matter what he did, Abe could not seem to get the inflation rate to rise over 2%, the nation's goal. By the year 2013, Japanese public debt would exceed 1 quadrillion yen, or 10.46 trillion US dollars, which was about twice the country's annual GDP at the time. For anyone who's seen any of the videos where I've talked about GDP to debt ratios and many countries it being bad when it's over 100%, yeah, this was over 200%. That's really dangerous. This was already the largest debt ratio of any nation. Japan is the most indebted nation. And it's not like this was going to get any better. The national debt would continue to balloon, and by March of 2023, going to this last year, it was estimated to be 263% of GDP. That is the highest debt rate of any nation in the world. And all of this sounds like an utter catastrophe. But then there's the little fact that Japan spent so much of its time and money buying up its own government debt to the tune of 70%. So when we say that 263% number, that isn't actually as apocalyptic as it sounds, because a lot of that debt, for all intents and purposes, literally doesn't matter. There's no interest that is on it. It's money to the government through the Bank of Japan, so it essentially owes itself, and the only way that's going to grow is if they continue to borrow. The biggest looming problem that is facing Japan, though, is its demographics, something that I probably need to do an entire separate video on for both Japan, Korea, China, and many of the other nations that are facing similar issues. Japan has one of the oldest populations in the world. Since the year 2010, the population has been decreasing, and that is something that is only increasing with time. Not the population, the rate at which it's decreasing. With automation replacing many jobs and less people in the workforce by the year, Japan will be facing a severe workforce problem in the future. The only real solution that seems likely to work is increasing immigration, but that is going to be hard considering that Japan has traditionally been one of the most ethnically homogenous societies in the world and has not been very keen on immigration and welcoming in of outsiders. To combat this drop in productivity, Japan has also tried to bring more women into the workforce, but also Japan has traditionally had fairly high levels of what we in the West would consider misogyny in the workplace that has oftentimes kept women from advancing in their careers. In fact, Japan has one of the highest rates of female, what can I say here on YouTube, self-deletion in the world. The pandemic would only make that worse, and the rate of what I'm talking about here would rise 83% in 1 year from 2020 to 2021. This is because when bad things happen to the Japanese economy, typically women are the first ones who would be laid off, as they oftentimes work more part-time roles and jobs in tourism, hospitality, and food services. To understand just how bad this is, Japan is the only G7 country where unaliving is the leading manner of death for young people aged 15 to 39, and self-deletions among those under 20 has been increasing even before the pandemic. Combine this with it being traditionally less common for Japanese citizens to go to therapy than the residents of most other highly developed countries, and you've got a mental health crisis on your hands. The country needs to address these issues if it hopes to move forward with a healthy workforce, but that also needs to be done hand in hand with many other modifications. So then, my friends, where does Japan stand now? Well, there has actually been some moderately good news lately. The Bank of Japan has announced in the last few months that it will raise interest rates above 0% in the near future for the first time in nearly 2 decades. This was an effort to force people to spend more and to stimulate inflation, which seems to have worked. Also, wages are going up as workers have demanded more pay in recent years. More income means more spending, and more spending means inflation, and Japan could really use some right now. If this continues and Japan can refocus on innovation and productivity again, who knows what's possible? With the currency of the nation, the yen, losing over a third of its value in the span of less than 3 years, this is something that will, technically speaking, help Japanese exports, even if it is going to hurt the average Japanese person. As for what will come next, who can really know, though? The people and the economy of Japan will endure, at least for a time, somehow, as they always have. My friends, this has been Stakuya with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you very much for listening and watching. I appreciate all of it. If you could like, comment, and subscribe, do anything you can to help my videos in the algorithm. It is something that really does help me, especially with the time, effort, energy, everything that has to be done in order to make these videos happen. It helps me, it helps my editors, it helps everything. So thank you, all of you. Let me know what we should cover next, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye, my friends.